Everyone has their favorite go-to slasher flicks to meet their twisted needs for a splatterfest. Two of those horror classics both feature an iconic villain who is hunting down suburban teens in a variety of inventive and gory ways.
Nice hearing from you, Carlos.
The films also changed the horror landscape forever in their own unique way. There's A Nightmare on Elm Street, horror legend Wes Craven's supernatural slasher flick from 1984, and his 1996 meta-horror film, Scream, with both movies creating a legacy and franchises that would subvert the genre in their own twisted way.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie.
But which of these brilliant horror classics deserves the slasher crown? Round 1. Plot. In A Nightmare on Elm Street, Nancy is a middle-class teenager with divorced parents who, along with her friends, begins to have hyper-realistic nightmares about a horribly burned and disfigured man in a striped shirt, fedora, and bladed glove that is trying to kill them, which is, of course, crispy-faced serial killer Freddy Krueger, and we'll get to that monster shortly, don't you worry. Now, before we continue, we'd like to thank you for watching Face Off. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and click on the bell so you can be notified each time a new video goes live. Now back to the show. After her friend Tina is brutally murdered by Krueger during a sleepover at a victim's house, Nancy becomes increasingly terrorized by the maniac in her sleep until she takes active steps to find the root of the evil within Krueger's relentless, dream-invading serial killer.
No running in the hallway.
In Scream, Sidney Prescott, played by Neve Campbell, is a 17-year-old high school senior who, during a spree of grisly murders, begins to receive threatening and taunting phone calls from somebody who claims to know who raped and murdered Sidney's mother, Maureen Prescott, a crime pinned on Liev Schreiber's Cotton Weary. Several characters are blamed and accused of the grisly murders until the true killer, or killers, are finally revealed. For the slightly more inventive villain, I mean bladed gloves and a grisly backstory, come on, plus a cool dream-focused narrative, this round goes to A Nightmare on Elm Street. Round 2. Cast. Although A Nightmare on Elm Street launched the career of one of Hollywood's biggest stars in Johnny Depp, albeit by splattering his insides all over the bedroom ceiling, the main protagonist of the movie is Heather Langenkamp's feisty and progressive Nancy Thompson. She leads a cast that also includes John Saxon, who plays Nancy's police cop father, best known for his roles in westerns and other horrors, where he usually also plays a cop or detective. Ronnie Blakely is Nancy's mother, and of course, Mr. Krueger himself, Robert Englund. Scream, on the other hand, pulls the rug from under the unsuspecting audience when leading actress and a very big star at the time, Drew Barrymore's character Casey, is murdered by a mysterious hooded villain wearing a Fun World Halloween costume right at the start of the movie. We're then introduced to the rest of the movie's cast, including friends Courtney Cox, another friend David Arquette, well, kinda, Skeet Ulrich, Rose McGowan, and the flick's main protagonist, Sidney, played by Party of Five's up-and-coming star, Neve Campbell. Oh, and Shaggy.
Zoinks!
Elm Street's Nancy Thompson leads a very good cast with one megastar in the making.
Son, I'm Captain Jack Sparrow. Savvy?
However, for a more impressive all-around cast, this round goes to Scream. Round 3, Slashers. Everyone loves a good old bad guy, and they don't come much more meaner than Freddy Krueger and Ghostface. Elm Street's disfigured villain is a masterful creation with a creepy-as-hell backstory to go with his inventive kills. The character is first introduced in A Nightmare on Elm Street and has regularly been portrayed by actor Robert Englund, with the exception of 2011's franchise reboot, but more on that later. The first movie introduces Krueger's backstory as a Springwood slasher, a serial killer of children whose parents burned him to death after he evaded prison.
But he can't get you now. He's dead, honey, because Mommy killed him.
He murders his victims from within their dreams, subsequently killing them in the real world, and is most commonly identified by his disgusting burnt face, red and green sweater, brown fedora hat, and trademark leather-bladed glove on his right hand. Quite the fit. Scream's Ghostface is a different beast than Freddy Krueger in that the costume is a little less inventive. However, it has also become an iconic horror trope that strikes fear into the hearts of moviegoers worldwide. Created by Kevin Williamson for the original Scream movie, the character's costume was actually designed by Fun World as a Halloween costume, whose original designer took inspiration for the mask from watching old Max Fleischer cartoons and, in particular, the ghostly characters that appeared in Betty Boop. It's been assumed that the design took inspiration from Edvard Munch's painting The Scream. However, the creator stated in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter that it was old 1930s cartoons that were the true inspiration. While Ghostface is an awesome villain and the costume is now so iconic that it is the most popular Halloween costume every year in the United States, we can't ignore how creepy and inventive the design and backstory for Krueger is. So, this round goes to A Nightmare on Elm Street. Round 4. Kills. Now on to the blood, the guts, and what we all come to watch these movies for. Well, maybe that's just old, sick, and twisted me. The kills. Both movies open with inventive, gruesome, and shocking death scenes to let the audience know what they're in for. In A Nightmare on Elm Street, the first time we witness Freddy Krueger's demented dream-hopping monster unleashes fury, it's truly disturbing. Teenager Tina Gray has already been tormented by Krueger at the start of the movie when some of her friends, including protagonist Nancy Thompson, sleep over at her house. She's brutally murdered by Krueger while she sleeps. Her boyfriend Rod watches on helplessly as her body is slashed and thrashed around her bedroom. Later on, Johnny Depp is also dispatched by Krueger in another very bloody death scene. And we also get severed fingers, strangulation, and death by being pulled through a window?
Hello?
Hello?
Yes?
Who is this?
Who are you trying to reach?
Scream doesn't hold back on the bloodshed as well, and the first to be knocked off to the shock of audiences upon release was Drew Barrymore's Casey Becker. While innocently making herself some popcorn in the kitchen, Casey receives a phone call from a mysterious caller that starts as a seemingly harmless chat about horror movies, and it escalates to something more sinister, and before you know it, her boyfriend is gutted on the patio and she is stabbed to death with her lifeless corpse left hanging from a tree for her parents to find. We're also treated to more stabbings, death by garage door, throats being slit, and finally the true killers, who turn out to be Sidney's boyfriend Billy and his friend Stu, electrocuted by TV and shot in the head respectively. For the invention and technical innovation used to shoot the scenes, this round goes to A Nightmare on Elm Street. Round 5, Girl Power. Wes Craven conceptualized Nancy after talking to his daughter, who questioned him over a scene in his 1982 movie Swamp Thing, in which the heroine clumsily and stereotypically trips and falls over nothing. He wanted the character of Nancy to lead the revolution in the positive portrayal of women in his films, and despite some near misses with Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger, she eventually finds a way to catch and defeat the supernatural killer. Well, after he's brutally slaughtered most of her friends and family, that is. Nancy, however, is a strong and dependable lead that fits Craven's vision for a more progressive female character very well. She wouldn't return for the sequel, but did come back for 1987's A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, and 1994 Wes Craven's New Nightmare. While Scream's ensemble cast all get a chance to shine in their own right, it is Campbell's Sidney Prescott who becomes the focal point for the franchise, which was almost not to be, as Drew Barrymore was first cast as a lead, only for scheduling conflicts to reduce her involvement to first act slasher bait. Despite Sidney discovering that one of the Ghostface killers is actually her boyfriend, who it is revealed murdered Sidney's mother for having an affair with his dad, she doesn't run from her problems and instead faces her tormentors head on, and finally delivering the killer shot herself. Elm Street's Nancy Thompson is arguably a superbly written female character and holds her own against one of the all-time greatest horror villains in history repeatedly. However, For more consistent moments of bravery across a franchise, this round goes to Scream. Round 6, Law Enforcement. The overarching aspect of law enforcement in A Nightmare on Elm Street is that Lieutenant Don Thompson is the father of protagonist Nancy and the ex-husband of her mother, Marge. The competence of the cops in Elm Street can be called into question, though, as they incorrectly arrest Rod Lane by using Nancy as bait for the murder of his girlfriend Tina, and also allowed pre-toasted Freddy Krueger to leave police custody due to a technicality.
Somebody forgot to sign the search warrant in the right place, and Krueger was free just like that.
After Rod's apparent suicide, which, as we know, was actually Krueger's handiwork, Dawn ignores Nancy's claims that Krueger has been resurrected, and although they have become estranged, Dawn eventually realizes Nancy was correct and helps her attempt to catch the serial killer in the movie's finale. On the other hand, or glove, Scream has a very different type of police department from Elm Street Springwood, and that is due to one character in particular, David Arquette's Deputy Sheriff Dewey Riley. The goofy character has become a favorite with fans over all 4 soon-to-be 5 films, and Craven initially intended to kill him off at the end of the first movie when he was stabbed by Ghostface. However, Craven actually filmed an additional scene in which Dewey survives, and when test audience reacted positively to this cut of the film, the scene made the final cut. So, despite the family connection in A Nightmare on Elm Street, we can't overlook the mistakes made by the Springwood Police Department, and so for this, and the fact that Dewey has become a mainstay in all the movies, this round goes to Scream. Round 7, Critical Reception. When A Nightmare on Elm Street was released back in 1984, it was met with a largely positive critical reaction. The Washington Post praised the film, stating that, for such a low-budget movie, A Nightmare on Elm Street is extraordinarily polished. And that although the genre has built-in limitations, director Wes Craven faces the challenge admirably. Other reviews praised the movie's villain Freddy Krueger, stating that he was the most chilling figure in the genre since The Shape made his debut in Halloween. Although some critics thought the relationship between Nancy and her alcoholic mother was underwritten, overall the movie was a hit, not only creating an iconic villain, but a sustainable franchise. Scream was also met with praise from critics, but for different reasons. The approval rating for the film on Rotten Tomatoes is 79% based on 75 reviews, while the critical consensus for the film states that horror icon Wes Craven's subversive deconstruction of the genre is sly, witty, and surprisingly effective as a slasher film itself, even if it is a little too cheeky for some. Empire called it clever, quick, and bloody funny with fiendishly clever, complicated plot which deftly mixes irony, self-reference, and wry social commentary with chills and blood spills. It was the movie's self-awareness that really set it apart from other similar movies in the genre and is arguably another triumph for director Wes Craven. So while A Nightmare on Elm Street earned deserved praise upon release, the critical reaction is arguably more in favor of its competitor in this face-off. So the round therefore goes to Scream. Round 8, Iconic Moments. Man, where do we start with the iconic moments from these movies, as both have memorable scenes that are now etched in the minds of horror fans around the globe. Starting with A Nightmare on Elm Street, we have to go back to that moment first, when Johnny Depp's Glenn has his insides painted all over the bedroom wall.
Not sure I deserve that.
However, the film has many other iconic sequences and ideas that are worth a mention, including the concept, the notion of someone killing a person in their sleep was a truly terrifying idea. One, two, the eerie nursery rhyme sung by the 3 young girls skipping rope when Freddy assembles his bladed glove for the first time. The bedroom scene in which Krueger pushes through the wall while Nancy sleeps. Tina, death scene. The final confrontation between Nancy and Krueger, plus the monster's iconic first appearance. Wes Craven's Scream also showcases many memorable sequences, starting with that shocking opening scene and the horror of Casey's parents finding her lifeless body hanging from a tree. Other highlights include Randy running through the rules of being in a horror movie, Tatum's death by garage door, the first meeting between Sidney and Ghostface, which is a masterclass in building tension, Principal Himbry's grisly death, and who can forget the creepy as hell moment that Billy and Stu reveal themselves to be the villains of the movie, just showing how unhinged they really are. Due to how original the concept was, the wild imagination behind the kills, and how iconic the character has been overall, this round goes to A Nightmare on Elm Street. Round 9. Sequels. Sequels. You either love them or hate them, and often they can be hit and miss in terms of building the legacy of the characters and the mythology. In the case of A Nightmare on Elm Street, this is certainly true. First sequel, Freddy's Revenge, was met with a mixed response from critics. It was released in 1985 when Jack Shalder stepped into the director's chair and writing duties went to David Chaskin. Craven returned on co-writing duties for Part 3 Dream Warriors in 1987 that showcased some pretty awesome kills. 1988's Part 4, The Dream Master, saw Die Hard 2's Rennie Harlan on directing duties and showcased some pretty cool scenes, including a time loop that mirrors how nightmares often work, and was followed by Part 5, The Dream Child. That's a fun but cheesy entry in the series. Next up was Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare in 1991, which shockingly wasn't the final nightmare, followed by Wes Craven's return to the franchise with 1994's New Nightmare, a standalone movie in which Krueger haunts the cast and crew of movies about him in the real world. 9 years later, Freddy returned to do battle with another horror icon in Ronnie Yu's Freddy vs. Jason, and the series is rounded off by a much criticized reboot of the franchise in 2010, starring Watchmen's Jackie Earle Haley and directed by Samuel Bayer. It's safe to say the movie does not enhance the legacy of the franchise. On the flip side, Scream hasn't managed to spawn as many sequels as Elm Street has yet. However, creator Kevin Williamson initially attached 5-page proposals for potential sequels to Scream when he originally sold the script, hoping to entice prospective buyers into investing into a film and franchise. Due to the massive success of the film, Scream 2 has arrived less than a year after the original, again directed by Craven, and was met with favorable reviews, some even saying that it was better than the first. Scream 3 saw Craven return to direct again and see Sidney Prescott go into self-imposed isolation following the events of the first two movies, only to return when the new Ghostface starts killing the cast of a film within a film, Stab 3. Craven's fourth entry in the series is 2011's Scream 4, and pits Sidney against a Ghostface killer back in Woodsboro after 10 years, earning favorable reviews. The series has shown such longevity that Scream 5 is due to be released in early 2022, with franchise regulars Nev Campbell, Courtney Cox, and David Arquette all returning, with new co-directors Matt Bettinelli-Alpin and Tyler Gillett. Although A Nightmare on Elm Street remains a bona fide classic and has some iconic moments within its sequels, they do eventually take a dip in quality. The same can be said for the Scream franchise, with number 3 in particular being met with a lukewarm reception. This round is a draw. Round 10, Legacy. Despite both films spawning many sequels, the franchises also have a lasting legacy in other ways. A Nightmare on Elm Street not only spawned a villain that would haunt the dreams of moviegoers forever, but also one that was original and had an albeit divisive sense of humor when murdering teens. The character is so etched in society as horror trope, and this was further exemplified by TV spin-offs, video games, numerous references in other popular culture, even if the reboot appears to have derailed any further installments of the character for now. Before Scream was unleashed on the world in 1996, the horror genre was in decline. Most of the films in cinemas were sequels to already established franchises, such as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Friday the 13th, while a glut of straight-to-home, low-budget horror flicks were also created. Scream, with his sexy cast and innovative story that mocked horror cliches and arguably reinvigorated the genre.
I'll be right back.
Such was the critical and financial success of the movie that it is also credited with helping spawn a new era of post-Scream horror, with such films as 1997's I Know What You Did Last Summer, and sequels to popular franchises in Halloween H2O 20 years later, and Bride of Chucky. And it's also heavily parodied in Scary Movie. Despite Scream's Ghostface killer becoming synonymous with yearly Halloween fans dressing up and the creators designing a shocking and brutal villain, this round goes to the movie that brought gorehounds a true original character in Freddy Krueger. A Nightmare on Elm Street. Verdict. Horror fans love a classic villain, and both Scream and A Nightmare on Elm Street movies provide slashers that we can't get enough of. Elm Street's Freddy Krueger is a true original, a character born out of a literal nightmare scenario who pushes the kids of the parents who torched him to death. His legacy will remain, and the franchise, despite a blip with the reboot in 2010, lives on with many a gut-wrenching and memorable moments. Scream managed to reignite the horror box office at a time when audiences were bored of sequels and the rehashing of overtired horror tropes. Its knowingly self-referential and jokes were refreshing and made horror fans look at the genre with a fresh spin. However, we have to give this particular face-off to the franchise that made going to sleep potentially bloody as hell. A Nightmare on Elm Street. Don't let us have the final word, though. Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. Before they became two of cinema's greatest horror heroines, Laurie Strode and Sidney Prescott were just simple, down-to-earth teenagers unprepared for how their lives would be turned upside down by psychotic, masked villains. They represent the very best of the final girl archetype, wholesome, chaste, attractive, but when the going gets tough, they become strong, proactive, and courageous. However, it's never an easy journey from wallflower to certified badass, and both of these characters had to go through hell before transforming into the icons they are now. So for this very challenging face-off, we're gonna throw Laurie and Sidney into the ring together. Settle down now.
No.
And see who comes out the victor. That being said, we're not doing their entire filmography, as that would require figuring out which Laurie Strode timeline we're dealing with for starters.
These timelines are so confusing.
No, we're just focusing on Laurie and Sidney and their debut films, 1978's Halloween and 1996's Scream, respectively. The origin stories, if you will, of two of our favorite leading ladies. We know that however this pans out, it's gonna be controversial for you horror hounds, but that's why we take such burdens upon ourselves. It's a tough job, but somebody's gotta do it. And besides, it's only a movie. So let's get to it.
Face Off!
Disclaimer. No actual science was used to determine the outcome of Face Off. Your results may vary. Please do not consume Face Off if you are allergic to conjecture, opinion, or general nonsense.
Round 1. Personality. Naturally, years of being terrorized along with having your friends and loved ones brutally murdered will turn you into a stone-cold angel of vengeance who can stare death in the face and not even bat an eye. But everyone's gotta start somewhere, and our two ladies began their legacies as innocent, unassuming girls merely living their best high school lives in their small towns. When we meet Laurie, she's a completely relatable character to anyone who wasn't one of the popular kids in school. Quiet, friendly, and a tad on the introverted side. Director John Carpenter doesn't flesh out the character too much, and that's okay, because we know what we need to know minutes after meeting her, especially after seeing her interact with her two brash and bossy friends. Once she starts seeing a mysterious figure, or shape if you prefer, around her neighborhood, Laurie's correctly on alert, but it's not until the horrors of the situation around her are made clear that everything changes for her. It's not hard to sympathize with the levels of panic and fear she goes through until the very end of her ordeal, and perhaps The most admirable thing about her is that she always keeps the safety of the children in mind first. And you know, she's not getting paid enough for that shit. Sidney Prescott is similar in plenty of ways when introduced. A little shy but comes out of her shell when she's surrounded by friends. She emotes perfect girl next door vibes throughout the majority of the film. Unlike Laurie, however, Sidney carries around some major baggage underneath that virtuous facade. Her mother was murdered a year earlier, which would obviously disturb anyone. Sidney's quietly dealing with the ramifications of that event when a new pair of murders occur in her town, which once again points a spotlight on her as people begin to wonder if there's a connection. There's clearly a fighter already brewing in Sidney during the early stage of Scream, and the clear notion that she's approaching a breaking point that could damage her or perhaps anyone who messes with her.
Fuck you both!
While we love Laurie for all her low-key charm, Sidney's a fairly more complex character, and of course, we root for both of them from start to finish. It's Sidney's journey that truly feels like a complete arc. So we gotta give this first round to Sidney Prescott. Round 2, performance. Things are already getting difficult now, as even though these characters are beloved, they wouldn't be nearly as cherished were it not for how compelling and perfectly cast the two leads are. Though our parents are essentially Hollywood royalty, Janet Leigh and Tony Curtis, Jamie Lee Curtis was not a household name at the time. In fact, Halloween was her very first feature film. But right off the bat, she proves to be a magnetic screen presence, perfectly embodying the timid and cautious Laurie Strode. When the going starts to get tough, Curtis displayed some pipes that would help her land the infamous Scream Queen nickname.
Hello, help me! Can you please help me? Please! Can't you hear me? Oh, God! Oh, help me, please!
She even rivals her mom's classic shriek in Psycho. Jamie Lee's performance in the third act of Halloween is basically as great as any you'll witness in a slasher picture, and it's surely no wonder why Curtis quickly became a marquee name in the business, and it wasn't because of her famous parents. Neve Campbell was perhaps a little more well-known than Curtis was, but not by much. The 22-year-old actress was best known for the TV series Party of Five and to a lesser extent the cult classic The Craft, which was released 7 months prior to Scream. Not unlike Jamie Lee, Neve exudes something very endearing right off the bat, so we as an audience are protective of her and wish to see her overcome whatever nightmare she's about to encounter. But Campbell isn't just a pretty face, she really excels at capturing Sidney's tenuous grasp on staying composed throughout. We're never less than convinced Sidney is going through an emotional roller coaster, and that's thanks to Neve's extremely solid work, selling her fear, her frustration, and ultimately, her resolve. It's easy to take for granted how good these two actors are in the roles that help launch their careers, but true fans know that Laurie and Sidney are icons because they're made flesh and blood by two incredibly talented performers, and with that, we're gonna have to call this one a draw. Round 3, best final girl moments. So we've covered the personalities and the performances, but let's get into the thick of it by looking at the best final girl moments these two provide, which also might be construed as asking you this. Which one would you rather be with when the knife hits the flesh and the bodies start dropping? Of course, we're still only focusing on the first films in their respective franchises, so we can't include gun-toting marksman Laurie or crisis counselor Sid. But no doubt, even when they weren't professionals at kicking slasher ass, the gals rose to the occasion to help stop the boogeyman, or at the very least, keep him down for a little bit. It must be said that Laurie takes a while to unleash her inner badass when she discovers the horrible truth about the fate of her friends. Laurie is understandably a wreck, screaming and scrambling for neighbors who won't lift a finger to help her. As previously mentioned, she does have the foresight to protect the kids she's looking after, and when confronted face to face with the Shape, Laurie's instincts kick in and she's able to spring into action with the help of a few household items. She may be a total mess during this ordeal, but you can't claim Laurie doesn't know how to protect herself in situations most of us would just roll over for. Sidney, on the other hand, always seems up for a fight. Not that battling an evil maniac comes easy for her, but crying and curling up in a corner isn't really her bag. Let's not forget, Sidney faces off against Ghostface a couple of times before the finale, once in her house. And once in the school bathroom, and both times she handles herself quite well, foiling the bastard's plans with her inability to give up without a fight. Add to that, she's still willing to go to a house party in the middle of nowhere and hook up with her maybe psychotic boyfriend Billy. Sidney Prescott is no shrinking violet. And the capper, when she's faced with the horrible truth that her boyfriend is indeed a psycho, as is goofy pal Stu, Sidney figures out a way to escape death, turn the tables on the villains, and grease them both with a little well-timed help from enemy Gale Weathers, of course. It's that kind of perseverance that helps Sidney win this round, though as always, Laurie put up a hell of a good fight. Verdict: Sidney Prescott. Round 4, Circle of Friends. Neither of our heroines go through these perils by their lonesome, and it's interesting to take a look at the company they keep. As nobody is perfect, so it goes that nobody's friends are perfect either, and one might say these girls have some problematic pals in their midst. We start with Laurie, whose best and perhaps only two friends are Annie and Linda. Not unlike Laurie, these characters are somewhat thinly sketched, but nonetheless, special thanks to a couple of persuasive performances. Both are quite a bit more headstrong and confident than Laurie, and we immediately get the sense that they call the shots in almost every scenario. It might not even be improper to assume they're the mean girls of their school. If they're not exactly sympathetic, we can admire their take-no-crap attitudes, and given how many slashers render their female supporting characters completely unremarkable, Annie and Linda at least feel like real people who deserve better than the nasty fates they endure. Sidney's friends, well, that's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, look, she's got a great one in the form of Rose McGowan's Tatum, who is her ride or die until she actually dies, and a very solid support system. There's slightly creepy video store clerk Randy, who, despite his longing for Sid, turns out to be a decent enough guy, especially when we know he's not the big bad, and of course, Deputy Dewey, Tatum's good-natured, if slightly in over his head brother. Then there's boyfriend Billy, a guy who just seems off when we suspect he's getting a bad rap. Sidney's a smart girl, but Billy's such an effective sociopath that she ultimately can't see through his misunderstood bad boy facade. Stu is no slouch in the sociopath department either, channeling a goofy frat bro image while hiding a pretty sick puppy underneath. We can't blame Sidney or anyone else for not seeing these dudes for the rotten apples they are, so let's not judge too harshly here. So if we take out Billy and Stu, who were not such good friends as it turns out, we're talking about Tatum, Randy, and Dewey against Annie and Linda. As far as being actual decent friends go, we'd probably have to side with the Scream team, but there's no denying the Halloween girls make a pretty indelible impression on the viewer. With friends like these, we're gonna chalk it up as a draw. Round 5, the villains. So now we've come down to the evil forces at work in these two classic films, the people who make life a living hell for our protagonists. While any of us would be hard-pressed to endure a few hours with these bloodthirsty lunatics, our final girls manage to survive their plights. But which is the more impressive feat? Laurie Strode is up against nothing less than the personification of evil, and while Michael Myers is still just a man, he's also a force of nature. Before the many different sequels and explanations for what and why he is, Michael Myers was an escaped mental patient who had murdered his older sister on Halloween night and waited ever so patiently for the chance to do some more killing. When unleashed upon the world again, Michael heads right on home and gets back to work only to be foiled after 4 murders, excluding a couple of poor dogs by Laurie and the good Dr. Loomis. Michael was the one to really start it all, the single-minded killer who can't be stopped no matter how many times you stab him, shoot him, or send him flying off the top floor. That, and the fact that Laurie makes it out of this nightmare alive, is all the more impressive. Sidney's antagonists are only human as well, very much so. Warped by too many horror movies as well as a past traumatic event in Billy's case, these two knuckleheads are so scary exactly because they're basically a couple of dudes. Easily able to blend into society while harboring plenty of twisted thoughts and dark secrets. It's only when exposed by the genuinely resilient Sidney that they falter, missing 2 opportunities to kill her early on and completely blowing it in the end because they've simply underestimated her. While clever enough early on, they prove to be too self-assured and ill-prepared for the mighty Sidney Prescott. While Billy and Stu are a formidable team, and hats off to Sidney for dealing with both a death blow, you just can't come at the king. Michael Myers is one of the great horror villains of all time, and yes, we're still only talking about the original 1978 film, and he makes mincemeat out of 2 guys who probably really admired him. So for this round, we gotta hand it to Laurie Strode. While Laurie may have defeated temporarily the more imposing villain, at the end of the day, we have to crown Sidney Prescott the queen in this matchup. Final verdict, Sidney Prescott. Obviously, we all love Laurie, and as time went on, she became a badass for the ages. But if we're strictly going by the first films, Sidney is the more fleshed out character whose survival instincts really come in handy when trapped in a frightening bind. If we had to pick one of these 2 unforgettable women to be on our side during a mad slasher outbreak, Sidney from 1996's Scream would be our go-to gal. Now excuse us, we plan on making popcorn and watching Dr. Dementia 6 straight hours of horror movies.
Little Lindsay Wallace won't know when to hit her.
But don't let us have the final word. Tell us in the comments which Scream Queen reigns supreme, Halloween's Laurie Strode or Scream's Sidney Prescott. And as always, thanks for watching.